Good morning. This is our last lesson on solving quadratic equations, with the exception of probably a day to just practice all these different strategies. Last class, we talked about 4 strategies that can be used to solve quadratic equations. We've got square rooting, which is limited in its use. You can use it when b is equal to 0. We've got factoring, which is the preferred strategy when it is possible, but not everything is factorable. Last class, we went over a strategy called completing the square, which works well when your a value is 1 and your b value is even. It does work in all situations, but when a is not 1 and b is not even, you probably don't want to use it. So I have here written, sometimes factoring is impossible and completing the square is impractical, because I'm not on this mission to show you the hardest, most convoluted, troublesome ways to solve problems. I want you to be able to solve the problems in the easiest way possible. And so that means having a lot of tools in your toolbox, and sometimes certain tools are impractical. When factoring is impossible and completing the square is impractical, then we can use something called the quadratic formula, which I hate, but here it is. Quadratic formula looks like this. When I was taught to say it I was taught it in Algebra 1, but I was made to really memorize it in geometry. I'm not entirely sure what we were doing with it in geometry because you don't see a lot of quadratics there, but that is who had me memorize it. He had me memorize it like this. The opposite of b, again, that phrasing, the opposite of, meaning you're going to flip the sign of whatever b is. The opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So a couple of things to note here. I honestly think this is an awful formula. It's got pluses and minuses, and you have a negative here, you have a negative here. So we know from experience that anytime we have minus signs, it's just more error prone. We've got multiple grouping symbols. You've got your grouping symbol of the radical, and then you have the grouping symbol of the fraction bar. And so there's a lot of different places where you can mess up your order of operations. When you are solving this by hand, you're going to start with squaring the b. Okay, that's going to be the first thing you do, and that will always be a non-negative number. If b is 0, then you'll have a 0 there. Although if b is 0, you're probably going to use another strategy anyway. So it's pretty safe to say that most of the time you're going to have a positive number there, and you'll never have a negative. Then you're going to do all this multiplication, and then you're going to subtract. And I will give you some tips and some pointers for avoiding mistakes in doing that. Then you're going to take the square root. Then you're going to split the problem up. And you're going to split it up into an addition problem and a subtraction problem, because we can't obviously add and subtract at the same time. So there's really 2 problems being represented here. One with that's adding and one that's subtracting. And then when you've done that, then you're going to divide by the 2a. So that's the order that you have to do things in. Please be careful of a couple of things. Make sure that your square root always covers the entire b squared minus 4ac. That is called the discriminant. It actually tells you what kind of roots your parabola has. And make sure that your fraction bar goes all the way across, because this, okay, b squared minus 4ac, okay, is different from this. In this one, you're going to divide before you add and subtract. This one, you add, subtract before you divide. So the length of that fraction bar actually does change your order of operations. You want to make sure you get it right. Also, make sure that you're not doing this. Okay? That's the 4ac. You know what it says. This is doing the subtraction first and then taking the square root. This you're going to square root and then you're going to subtract. So the length of those symbols does matter. It is not a trivial part of the quadratic formula. Okay, now a few other things. You should have this memorized. Now, this is available on most of your reference sheets for most of the tests that you take. So as long as you know when you're supposed to use it, you recognize the kind of problem you're seeing, and you're like, that is a quadratic formula problem, you can usually go back and reference this. I do recommend that you have it memorized, though. So several years ago, when I was working with Miss Bradford, she had a story for helping students remember the quadratic formula. It's a very not politically correct story. So I'll put that disclaimer on the front end of it. And the story goes like this. A negative boy couldn't decide whether to go to a radical party or be square. So he missed out on 4 awesome chicks because it was all over by 2 a.m. And so I'll go through and explain the pieces of the story. So we have a negative boy. B is the B value, B for boy. Negative means you're going to flip the sign. Couldn't decide kind of represents that, like, am I adding, am I subtracting? I don't know. Like, I mean, algebraically, we're going to do both. But you couldn't decide whether to go to a radical. Another word for a square root is a radical. So it's a radical party or be square. That's something like my dad would say. My dad is in his 80s. So what are you, square? But it's like kind of another expression for not cool. So you couldn't tell, we go to the party or be square. So of course that's the B squared. Missed out. So he missed out. That's your subtraction sign. 4 awesome chicks. I think that's pretty self-evident. We're just using the letters there because it was all over. The all over represents the length of the fraction bar by 2 a.m. And then, of course, the a.m. is the A. Now, my disclaimer on that is that not one of you should be at any parties at 2 o'clock in the morning. No, absolutely not. Say no. Go home. Be with your parents. Be with your family. That's a wiser choice. The point of the story is only to help you memorize the quadratic formula. It is not a prescription for life. So make good choices. There we go. Okay, so there's the story. If it helps you memorize the quadratic formula, then yay. If it doesn't, then no, and don't go to parties, okay? Just don't go to any parties at all. That'll solve our problem there. All right, so how do we use this formula? So let's go into the process for using it. When you're using the formula, you are first going to have to put and I'm not going to give you an example on this one because of it's mostly procedural. But the first thing you need to do is put your equation in standard form. Okay, that has to be done first. And by that we mean ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. You have to get them all on one side. You have to get it equal to 0. If you don't do that, then when you pick your A, your B, or your C, you'll end up flipping one of the signs. Okay, so you're going to end up with 5 for B instead of -5, or -5 instead of 5. And that, of course, is going to cause you to get the wrong answer to the problem. So the first thing you have to do is put your equation in standard form. And if you don't remember what standard form is, I've got it written there. Once you have your equation in standard form, then you need to identify A, B, and C, keeping in mind that some of them might be 1 or might be 0. So those are 2 awesome numbers, but don't forget about them. And then we have the ever popular plug and chug. And by that we mean plug the A, the B, the C into the formula, and chug just means you're going to do order of operations. You're going to grab your calculator. You're just going to simplify it step by step until you get down to the answer. Order of operations is a huge, huge issue. So here's some things to keep in mind when you are doing the plug and chug. Do B squared first. And this will never be negative, like ever, okay? You will never have a negative number for B squared, because if B is positive and you square it, it'll still be positive. If it's negative and you square it, it will be positive. And if it's 0 and you square it, it'll be 0, but it definitely won't be negative. So if you're ever doing these problems and I'm looking at your work and you have a square root and the first thing underneath it starts with a negative, you have done something wrong, and that's probably what it was. So I'm warning you in advance. Then do the B squared minus 4ac. That is probably the number one error spot if A or C or both are negative. So you end up with a minus sign, and then you end up plugging in negatives, and it's just a very sore spot where students aren't quite sure, whether you're multiplying all these negatives together, whether you should end up adding the number or subtracting the number. So that's just a sore spot. And I have some pointers for you on that so you can avoid mistakes. Then you're going to take the square root, then split into 2 parts, and then simplify further, if possible. And sometimes there is no, you can't do any simplification. So if you're lucky, there'll be nothing to do at that point. But often there is. So I've got a couple of examples of 2 problems here where they kind of simplify different ways, and I'll talk you through the steps. So let's see. We'll switch over to this color. So this is our first example. It's 3x squared plus 2x minus 1 equals 0. And then I'm going to copy the formula down. And negative boy, that use negative, there we go, couldn't decide whether to go to a radical party or b square. So we missed out on 4 awesome chicks because it was all over by 2 a.m. There you go. There's your formula. So step number 1 is to put the equation in standard form. This one is already in standard form, and a lot of times they are. So a lot of times, your quadratics come in standard form, I guess, because it's standard. So, things come standard. But if it's not, you need to put it in standard form first. Second step was to identify A, B, and C. So in this case, A is 3, B is 2, and C is -1. Do a quick double check and make sure you have the correct signs on those and you have not usually dropped a negative. If you're going to make a mistake there, that's probably what it is. And then step 3 is plug and chug. So we're going to take the 3 and plug it in everywhere the A is. We're going to take the 2, plug it in everywhere the B is, and take the -1 and plug it in everywhere the C is. And then we have to hang on through all of our order of operations and hope we get to the end okay. So the opposite of B, well, B is 2, so the opposite of B would be -2, plus or minus. Here's my tip number 1. When you are putting this under the square root, always put B in parentheses. It's not necessary if B is positive, but it will be necessary if B is negative, especially if you're planning to use your calculator to do it. So one error-proof step there is to put your B value in parentheses. So I just put that off to the side there. Tip number 1, put B in parentheses to do the B squared. Minus 4 times A, which is 3, times C, which is -1, all over 2 times A, which is 3. I want to see this when I'm looking at your work, regardless of how else you're doing it. I want to see that you have correctly, put the problem in the right form and you have put the numbers into the right spots. Because that will help me see if you're having a algebra problem where you're not sure what the numbers are, how to put the equation in the right form, or if you're having an arithmetic, order of operations kind of problem. Those are 2 different kinds of problems that you might have doing this. And as a teacher, I want to know which kind of problem you're having because that's how I can help you. All right. Now, when you do this, there's a couple ways. I'm actually going to do the work out step by step here just to show you what it looks like. So you would want to do, I don't like where I put that. Okay, that looks like a little bit better right there. I said you'd want to do the B squared first. So 2 squared is 4. And then what I do is I usually think of it like this. Let me use, what color do I want to use? We'll use green. -4 times 3 times -1. Which would be +12, which means that this will be +12. And it'll be a +12 because so somebody's probably wondering, why is it a +12? You had a minus sign there. Right here, I have the minus, so I'm not ignoring it. But when I multiplied a negative times a negative, that gave me the positive. Okay. And then 2 times 3 is 6. Now we have to do the operation under the square root. So that's going to give us 16. And now we'll do the square root of 16, which is 4. And now we kind of stall out because we're stuck with this like indecisive moment here. Like, are we adding or subtracting? What are we doing here? So at this point, I'm going to split it up into 2 problems, and I'm running out of space. So one of those is going to be an addition problem, and the other one is going to be a subtraction problem. When I add them, negative 2 plus 4 is 2. And then I'll simplify that. 2 6 is 1/3. Here, negative 2 minus 4 is negative 6. And then negative 6 over 6 is negative 1. And you probably get an idea of why I don't like this. Honestly, the quadratic formula, the big advantage to the quadratic formula is that it always works. It works 100% of the time. You can use it on any quadratic, anytime, anywhere. It doesn't have the restrictions on it that the completing the square does, where like completing the square works well sometimes and horrible other times. The quadratic formula is very, very consistent, and it will always give you an answer for every single quadratic, including quadratics that have imaginary number answers, which we haven't even talked about yet. The big drawback to it is that it takes every problem and makes it long because there are so many steps to do. And the longer the problem is, the more opportunities that you have to make a mistake. It's pretty like thinking free. You don't have to make decisions. So I know with some of the problems that we do, we have to make decisions about the best way to proceed. Quadratic formula is not like that. It just is kind of error prone. Now, I would actually recommend that you take a shortcut here. It's not really a shortcut, but that you use your calculator, because this process right in here, okay, where I kind of came over to the side and I did this little calculation out, and then I imported it back, and then I added them together. You can go from this mess down to the 16 if you use your calculator. So that's my second tip for you. Use your calculator for b squared minus 4ac. This means that you will need to know your calculator, which is not your phone, okay, not your phone, but your like calculator that you own for your math classes now that you're in upper level math, that you would know how to use that, know how to use the parentheses, know how to talk to it for order of operations, and you can actually avoid the biggest error prone places in all of the quadratic formula by strategically using your calculator. So that's the first example. I will do another example, and then we'll open it up for practice. This next example is one that is not in standard form, so I wanted to go over that. In fact, this one, you might look at it and say that you don't even think it's a quadratic at all because you don't see an x squared. That there is an x squared in it, because if you notice, we do have some multiplication here. If I multiply this and I do 2x times x times x would give me the x squared. So the first thing we need to do in this problem is distribute the 2x through the parentheses. This will give us 2x squared, and then 2x times negative 1 is negative 2x. Notice that the c value is still on the wrong side. So that first step was to put it in standard form, which is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. If you look at mine, it is not in the right form. I need to subtract 3 from both sides. If you don't do that, you will get it wrong, because what you will do is you'll use a positive 3 for the c value instead of a negative 3, and that's going to change your answer and make it not right. So that was the first step. Now we need to identify the a, the b, and the c. So a is 2, b is negative 2, and c is negative 3. Do a quick double check on your signs. Make sure that you have everything positive and negative the way that it should be. Here's our formula. A negative boy couldn't decide whether to go to his radical party or B square. So he missed out on 4 awesome chicks because it was all over by 2 a.m. And now what I want to see is that you can take each of these numbers and put them into the formula in the correct spot with the correct notation. You have the parentheses where they're supposed to be. So we want to get some practice at this. X is equal to the opposite of b. Okay, you can thank my geometry teacher for that one. The opposite of negative 2 is positive 2. Plus or minus. Now, the tip we had. Put b in the parentheses to do the b squared. Just do it. Get in the habit of doing it. In this case, it will make a difference if you have those parentheses. Minus 4 times a times c. And notice my square root got a little bit short there. I'm going to make sure I lengthen it so that the square root goes over everything it's supposed to go over. All over 2 times 2. I am actually okay if you want to skip right to the 4, because usually doing 2 times whatever the a value is something you can do in your head. It'll be like 2 times 1 or 2 times 2 or 2 times 3. You can just go ahead and multiply it. Now here's what I recommend. This is my second tip here. Use the calculator for b squared minus 4ac. If you have a fair, it doesn't have to be super sophisticated. Some pretty basic scientifics will do this. Anything with a dual like line entry where you can see the line entry and then the answer on a separate line should allow you to do this. Take your calculator and put this into the calculator exactly the way that you have it written on your page. So if you can get this where you have the parentheses in the right spot, you put the numbers into the right spot, you should be able to enter that straight into your calculator, and your calculator is going to dump out the number 28. And what that's going to do is allow you to skip over some of the messier stuff there. And that's over 4. I'm actually okay with you stopping at this point for now. There is more that you can do to simplify this, but I am okay with you stopping right there. 2 plus or minus the square root of 28, because 28 is not a perfect square, so you can't do that part of the problem. You can't go 2 plus, it's not like doing 2 plus 3 and get a 5, like we did in the last one where we had integers there. And so you're going to stall out on the problem. So for now, you can actually stop the problem there, which essentially turned it into a, I don't know, we had some work up here, but the quadratic formula part only ended up being 2 steps. Now, just for clarity, okay, because I don't want to leave it unaddressed, the square root of 28, square root of 28, 28 will factor into 4 times 7. So you'd have the square root of 4 times the square root of 7. The square root of 4 is 2. Okay, and so that's 2 times the square root of 7. And then what you might notice is that you can actually do some more factoring. In the top, you can factor out a 2. And on the bottom, 4 factors into 2 times 2. So what I did here was I factored out a common factor of 2. So if I distribute it back in, I'd have like 2 and then 2 root 7. And then here, you can cancel out the common factors. And so the final answer would be 1 plus or minus the square root of 7 over 2. That is the answer that you would see on the SAT or on your EOC. They're going to show you the fully simplified version. For now, I'm okay with you leaving it here. And I'll show you when we get into like some test prep stuff, how you can use your answer to be able to pick the right answer. That's like a testing skill. But again, use your calculator in there. That will save you a lot of hassle, and it will still be showing the right amount of work. If you don't have a calculator that does that, I strongly suggest that you get one. I strongly suggest that you get a graphing calculator, which is kind of what I've said since August. Yeah. All right, so let's look at a practice problem. Don't know where that came from. Let's get rid of that. So practice. Here's the practice. So going to navigate your way through this. We have 2x squared minus 7x minus 15 equals 0. And as I did with the last lesson, I'm going to give you the answers, not so that you can impress me by having the answers, but so that you can know if you've done the problem correctly. And I cannot actually tell if this is a -3/2 or if my pen dribbled a bunch of ink. I don't have the work on my copy of the notes because I didn't want students to copy it off of my copy of the notes either. But I honestly can't tell. So on the next part, I am going to work the problem out. And if we're in class, we're going to just stop the video here. Okay, so for those of you following along at home, basically, if you're watching this video for review before your test, or the videos are public, so maybe there's other people watching these videos. I don't know. I don't know who's watching these videos, but I hope they're helpful. So we have our quadratic equation. This one is already in standard form. We want to make sure we identify A, B, and C. Do a double check on the signs there. Here's our formula. A negative boy couldn't decide whether to go to a radical party or B squares. So he missed out on 4 awesome chicks because it was all over by 2A. All right, so now we're going to plug in the A. We're going to plug in the B. We're going to plug in the C. And then we're going to just go for the ride. The opposite of B, the opposite of -7 would be a +7. Pro tip. Always put this in parentheses. If you always put it in parentheses, you will never make the mistake that of ending up with a negative number there. And yet still, a lot of people won't do it that way. And I don't know why. I don't know why people don't listen to me. So we put in the A, we put in the C, and then this is going to be all over 2 times 2. Then we're going to bust out our calculator. Because we're not going to tangle with stuff if we don't have to tangle with it. Okay. And when we do that, we are going to get 169. So that jumps over a lot of headache by using your calculator right there. And then 2 times 2 is 4. Now, you might not know the square root of 169 right off the top of your head, but hopefully you have a calculator that you can try some things out. It is 13. And so this ends up being, that is, I think, a Marathon High notification that just came in. Okay, and now we have to split that up, and we'll have, I can't remember, 7 plus 13 over 4, and 7 minus 13 over 4. 7 plus 13 is 20, and 20 divided by 4 is 5. And then this would be -6 over 4, which simplifies to -3/2, and there are the 2 answers. So there we go. I hope that lesson helped. Really what you need to do at this point is just practice using the formula, kind of find out what mistakes you're prone to make, whether they're calculator errors or sign errors. You just need to work through them, make them, correct them, think about them, and conquer them. But you can't do it without practice. So next up is practice.